A little bit about today, dysfunctional families. Y'all don't know nothing about that, do you? Y'all don't have no dysfunction in your family? Well, I tell you, if you don't think you have dysfunction in your family, you're the dysfunctional one. Because we all got it. We all got a weird uncle or something like that we just, it's part of life, right? We got dysfunction in our families. We just do. And, you know, one of the funniest things I've ever heard, like people that don't go to church, when they talk about reading the Bible, they're like, man, I can't read the Bible because it's boring. That's proof right there that you've never read the Bible, because there is some crazy stuff in the Bible. And we're going to focus on some of that stuff today. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the life of Joseph. Man, if you know anything about Joseph's life, woo, it was crazy, y'all, I'm telling you. His family history was just jack full of deceit and dysfunction. It was crazy. It seriously is on lines with like the craziest reality show that you can imagine on television now. It would probably trump all that. Just crazy. Let's just start here. First of all, he had two moms, okay? Not the way you might be thinking, but his father married two sisters, all right? Weird thing if you don't know the story, he worked for Laban, his future father-in-law, for 7 years to earn the hand of Rachel, which was the younger sister. He fell in love with her, said, I'll work for you 7 years if I can marry her. So he worked for Laban 7 years. I don't know exactly how this happened, I don't know, but somehow on the wedding day, they did the flippity-flop, and somehow Laban tricked him into marrying his older daughter, Leah. And that just caused a bunch of problems from that point on. So he agreed to work with him 7 more years and finally got to marry Rachel. But could y'all imagine that if your husband really wanted to marry your sister, really wanted to marry you, but he married your sister, and then y'all were both in the same home, would that cause some issues, you think? Maybe? Right? So if you could imagine, just caused a bunch of turmoil in the family, and not only between the wives, but also in the children, that passed down into their children. And here's the thing, that's definitely not a good way to start a relationship, but that trickling down into to the children kind of became a competition where Leah and Rachel wanted to provide more children for them. So they even got to the point where they were giving their maidservants to him. I don't know if in their minds, like, all right, well, if he sleeps with my servants, then that chalk one up for me if they get pregnant. I don't know how that was working, but it was crazy. They went to all kind of ways to add to the baby count. And unfortunately, his favorite wife, Rachel, was like way behind on the count. Okay, so that caused even more problems. And if you go back further than that, his father Jacob deceived his own father, Isaac, in order to steal the birthright from Esau. Some of y'all might be familiar with that account in the Bible. His family's backstory is just crazy, just really crazy. We're going to jump into the story when he was about 17 years old. Okay, have y'all ever heard of Joseph and the Coat of Many Colors or whatever? They've made productions on Broadway about it and different things. It's a pretty well-known story, even for people that didn't grow up in the church. But let me explain something to you. Joseph was his father's favorite son. Could you see where that can cause some problems, right? And not only he didn't try to be backward about it, he didn't try to cover the fact. He was very blatant about Joseph being his favorite son, even to the tune of he made him that special coat or that tunic. And one of the things that you have to know, there's different thoughts about what it actually looked like, whether it was actually different colors or whatever, but we know that it was long sleeved and it was all the way to the ground, okay, which was not a normal tunic. All right, most of the people in that day when they wore a tunic, it was sleeveless, it was waist length, because they were working garments. So as you can imagine, that kind of gives us the feeling that he kind of put him to the side like, you don't really have to work, right? I'm gonna give you this long sleeve, fancy, floor length tunic, and you're gonna wear that. And everywhere his brothers seen him, they seen that constant reminder that he's daddy's favorite, right? That caused a lot of problems. So not only did Joseph have this special garment that he wore as a sign of his father's blessing and approval, but he also was tasked with going and reporting on his brothers. Y'all have any tattletale siblings in your family? Right? So if you can imagine, Jacob would send them out and go check on your brothers and see what they're doing, and he would come back. And the Bible even says that he would come back and he would bring a bad report, right? They already didn't like him because they knew he was daddy's favorite. But then once you go on and telling on me, like it's on, right? We got issues. So the Bible is very clear that they literally hated Joseph. They hated him, all right? So we're going to jump in. The foundation, as you can see, is already very rocky. So Jacob also started having these dreams, okay? So we're going to jump in the book of Genesis 37, 5 through 11. It says, one day Joseph told his brothers what he had dreamed, and they hated him even more. Joseph said, let me tell you about my dream. We were out in the field tying up bundles of wheat. Suddenly my bundle stood up, and your bundles gathered around and bowed down to it. His brothers asked, do you really think you're going to be king and rule over us? Now they hated Joseph more than ever because of what he said about his dream. Joseph later had another dream, and he told his brothers, listen to what else I dreamed. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowed down to me. When he told his father about this dream, his father became angry and said, what's that supposed to mean? Are your mother and I and your brothers all going to come and bow down in front of you? Joseph's brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept wondering about the dream. So, one day, as I told you, part of what Joseph would be sent out to do is he would be sent out to give a report on how his brothers were doing. So, his brothers were out working, and his father had sent him out to get a report on the brothers. And they had moved from one place on to a further place, and so they were a good ways away from home. Well, when Joseph came over the horizon in his special garment, right, they could tell who he was from a long way off. The brothers started having a conversation. They was like, look at this dreamer. Like, we need to devise a plan to kill him and get rid of him. That's how bad the hate was. They wanted to kill him. Well, Reuben was his oldest brother. And Reuben, even though he didn't like him, right, he still had that disdain for him. He's like, man, he's our flesh and blood. We can't kill him. Right? So he devised a plan. He's like, let's not kill him. Let's do this. Let's grab him, and we're going to throw him in this empty cistern, this well. And we're going to leave him there. All right? We're not going to shed his blood. We're going to leave him there and teach him a lesson. What he was thinking in the back of his head is, once all my brothers chill out a little bit, I'm going to come back, and I'm going to get out of that cistern, and I'm going to take him home. Because the oldest brother was responsible for the family. So Reuben knew that he would have to give an account if Joseph didn't come home. Well, we're not really clear on exactly what happened, but we know they got a hold of him and they stripped him of his robe and they threw him in that cistern. Then they said they started having lunch, had a little picnic. Seems kind of weird to me, but okay. So somewhere in this scenario, Reuben left because what had happened, they looked out and they seen a merchant caravan coming. And they started talking to one another. It's like, man, you know what? If we just kill him or if we just leave him, we're not going to get anything from that. Wouldn't it be better off if we sold him as a slave to these merchants? At least that way we'd get some money, right? There's no reason to leave empty-handed. And that way we don't really have to shed his blood. So they agreed to that. But Reuben was gone because later Reuben came and looked in the cistern and seen that Joseph was gone. And he was wrought with despair, and he ripped his clothes and said, what are we going to tell Father now? So they devised a plan. They took Joseph's garment that his father had given him, and they went out and they killed a goat. And they began to splatter that garment with the blood of that goat. And here's the thing. If you pay attention to the text, they were trying to be tricky, right, in how they did this. So they didn't go back and said, hey, Pops, Joseph got killed. We found this. They took this garment that was one of a kind that everybody knew, and they was like, do you know who this is by chance? Have you ever seen this? Right? And Joseph knew immediately. He's like, my son's been attacked by wild animals and killed. So they deceived their father into believing that Joseph was attacked and killed by a wild animal. So Joseph has went from the favored son, and now he's being sold into slavery. So Like I said, they sold him to this merchant caravan for 20 pieces of silver. And they took him into Egypt. That caravan was on their way to Egypt to sell their goods. And they came upon a gentleman by the name of Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was the chief executioner in Egypt. He was a very high-ranking official in the Egyptian government. And when he seen Joseph, he found favor in Joseph, and he ended up purchasing Joseph to be his slave and took him into his home. We're going to jump back into Genesis 39, 4 through 6. It says, Potiphar liked Joseph and made him his personal assistant, putting him in charge of his house and all of his property. Because of Joseph, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's family and his fields. Potiphar left everything up to Joseph. And with Joseph there, the only decision he had to make was what he wanted to eat. Joseph was well built and handsome. Kind of an odd way to end the verse there, right? But that starts to make sense here in a minute. So, as you can see, Joseph has now went from the favorite son, one that obviously from what we learned about the garment that he normally wore, wasn't made to do a lot of hard labor. And now he's being sold as a slave to Potiphar to work as a servant in his home. But he found favor with Potiphar. And as the Bible tells us that everything that Joseph did, God blessed. And Potiphar noticed that, and he loved him because of that, and ended up putting him over every other servant in his home. So he became the overseer of the house. So you could go from favorite son to slave to overseer of the house. I guess that's a little step up, right? I guess that's better than being the bottom slave in the house. So he's put in a position of authority over the other servants in the home. Well, like I said, an odd way to end that last verse, but that last scripture ends that Joseph was well built and handsome. Potiphar's wife took notice of this. All right? And let me tell you, she was not a backward lady. She was pretty brazen. She started watching Joseph and watching how he would do his work in the house, and she would basically be stalking him, right? If he was on Facebook, she'd be scrolling back through his pictures like, oh my, oh my. So she had eyes for Joseph. So eventually she started hitting on him. And let me tell you, she wasn't, like I said, she wasn't backward. She literally was like, come in here and have sex with me. Joseph was like, I can't do that. Right, so Joseph tries to go and get away from her and do all this. But it was like every day she kept making these advances to Joseph, and Joseph kept turning her away and turning her away. Until one day, and I'm sure this was calculated by Potiphar's wife, Scripture tells us that Joseph had entered into the home and all the other male servants were absent from the house. And so it ended up being Potiphar's wife and Joseph. And of course, she didn't change the script. She was like, come have sex with me. And he's like, how can I do this evil thing? My master has given me, he's entrusted me with everything he has, and I cannot commit this great sin against God. And she made advances and grabbed a hold of him. And in his haste, he stripped out of the garment that he was wearing and he ran. Do you know that's what the Bible tells us to do with sexual temptations? It says to flee, to run. So he did exactly what he was supposed to do. And man, did that make her mad. You know the saying that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, right? She was not happy. And so she started to devise this plan. And she's like, you know what? I've got his garment. And she began to cry out to the other servants. And she started accusing Joseph of trying to rape her. So they all came in here. Joseph's long gone. But here she is with his garment in hand, right? So she's making all these accusations. And Potiphar gets back to the house. And she's carrying on and acting like, Potiphar, he's come to mock us, and he's done all this, and he tried to come into me. And Potiphar was angry and ended up imprisoning him. Now here's the funny thing. Let me ask you this question. Remember, Potiphar was the chief executioner in Egypt. Now if I'm the chief executioner, and my wife tells me that some dude came in and tried to rape her, do you think I'm putting my work into practice? Maybe putting him to death, you think? Maybe. Right? That would be common sense that he would be put to death. the thing was, he was not put to death. He was put in prison, which might suggest to us that maybe Potiphar might have been like, I know how she is. You know, I've seen how you act. I've seen how you've been watching him. So we don't know that for sure, but that would kind of suggest that Potiphar had his doubts exactly about what Joseph was being accused of. So he sent him to prison. So here's another step in the process. Favored son, prisoner, slave, overseer of the house. And now he ends up as a prisoner. So he's thrown into prison for a crime that he in no way committed. He did the exact thing that he should have done. And he avoided the trap being set by Potiphar's wife. But let's jump back into scripture. Genesis 39, 21 through 23. It says, while Joseph was in prison, the Lord helped him and was good to him. He even made the jailer like Joseph so much that he put him in charge of other prisoners and of everything that was done in the jail. The jailer did not worry about anything because the Lord was with Joseph and made him successful in all that he did. So even after being hit and bottom again, being sent to prison, God had favor on him and rose him up into the overseer of the prison. So he served in this role. And one thing you'll notice in scripture, we never read anything about Joseph complaining or blaming anyone for his circumstances, but he kind of like rolled with the punches, right? We can see that like every step of the way. So eventually, as in his role of overseer of the prison, he was making his rounds, checking on everybody. And the Pharaoh had two servants. One was his butler or cupbearer, some translations call it, and a baker that worked for them. And I don't know what they did, but somehow or another they made Pharaoh mad enough to get thrown into prison. So I don't know exactly what a cupbearer does wrong to end up in prison, or a baker. I guess he was picky about his baked goods. I don't know. But eventually both of them were put into prison. And Joseph, in making his rounds, came upon them one day and noticed that they looked really upset. So he asked him, he's like, you guys seem really sad. What's going on? And so they began to explain to Joseph that they had both had really odd dreams. And they did not understand what the dreams meant. And they were troubled by it. So Joseph said, well, doesn't God own the interpretation? He's like, tell me what they are, and God will reveal to me what your dreams mean. So the butler went first, and he began to explain to Joseph about this dream that he had. And we won't go into detail about all it was, but he explained the dream to me. He said, okay, here's what that dream means, butler. He's like, in 3 days, Pharaoh is going to call you back up, and you're going to be put back into the position that you previously had. Sounds pretty good, right? So the baker's like, oh, all right. Well, tell me my dream too then. That sounds good. Give me a good report. So the baker explains his dream to Joseph. And Joseph, again, not making things up, he's like, he could only tell him what God revealed to him. So your dream means this. In 3 days, Pharaoh will call you up. And you'll be killed, and your body will be hung in the trees, and birds will come and eat your body. Not such a good report, right? But you know what? Joseph was honest with him. And when we find out that in 3 days, both of those things came to be. But here's one thing that we know, that even though Joseph didn't complain and didn't try to push blame on people, we know that he wasn't content in his situation, right? Because before the butler was released back to his position, he went to the butler and he's like, remember me. When you get placed back in your position, don't forget about me. Please talk to the Pharaoh on my behalf and let him know that I'm in here, not because of any wrong that I've done. So don't forget me when what this dream has been interpreted to happen comes to pass. So 3 days later, the baker's put to death. Butler put back in his position as cupbearer or butler with Pharaoh. Unfortunately, as happens many times, when the butler got put back in his position, he forgot about Joseph, right? And 2 more years passed before anything else happens. So Now he's went from overseer of the prison to be a forgotten prisoner, right? He had seen that glimmer of hope and thought, maybe this is some way that God's going to use this situation to allow me to be released and not be imprisoned anymore. So 2 years passed, and in Genesis 41, 1 through 8, it says that this happened. The Pharaoh ended up having a dream. And this is the dream. 2 years later, the king of Egypt dreamed he was standing beside the Nile River. Suddenly, 7 fat, healthy cows came up from the river and started eating grass along the bank. Then 7 ugly, skinny cows came up out of the river and ate the fat, healthy cows. When this happened, the king woke up. The king went back to sleep and had another dream. This time, 7 heads of grain were growing on a single stalk. Later, 7 other heads of grain appeared, but they were thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed the 7 full heads. Again, the king woke up, and it had only been a dream. The next morning, the king was very upset. So he called in his magicians and his wise men and told them what he had dreamed, but none of them could tell him what the dreams meant. Finally, the power of recall after 2 years, thanks a lot, Butler. The butler hears about this and he's like, oh, was there something I was supposed to talk to Pharaoh about? So he finally remembers, man, I remember when, this is kind of a tricky position if you could think about it. Like, you don't want to go to Pharaoh like, hey, remember that time I made you mad, so mad you threw me in prison? So he kind of had to be tricky how he said this, but anyways, he was like, there was a time when I was in prison, and I remember someone in the prison that his God was able to tell us what our dreams meant. So after talking to Pharaoh about this, Pharaoh sent for Joseph. And Joseph was brought out of prison and was gotten ready. There was a process he had to go through before coming before Pharaoh. So he went through that process, and he came before the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh told him what he had dreamed. And again, he was giving all glory to God for the interpretation. But he began to interpret those dreams for Pharaoh, and he said, these dreams are one and the same. They both mean the same thing. And he told them, he's like, for the next 7 years, they're going to be years of great abundance. There's going to be plenty in the land of Egypt. But following those 7 years, there's going to be 7 years of extreme famine. Famine so bad that the years of abundance will be forgotten. So Joseph begins to devise a plan. He's like, this is what I would suggest you do. And he lays this plan out to Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh responds in this way. In Genesis 41, 37 through 43, it says, the king and his officials liked this plan. So the king said to them, no one could possibly handle this better than Joseph, since the Spirit of God is with him. The king told Joseph, God is the one who has shown you these things. No one else is as wise as you are or knows as much as you do. I'm putting you in charge of my palace, and everybody will have to obey you. No one will be over you except me. You are now governor of all of Egypt. Then the king took off his royal ring and put it on Joseph's finger. He gave him fine clothes to wear and placed a gold chain around his neck. He also let him ride in the chariot next to his own, and people shouted, make way for Joseph. So Joseph was governor of Egypt. We see this pattern continually repeating itself in Joseph's life. Could you imagine waking up a prisoner, and by the end of the day, you're governor over all of Egypt? Crazy, right? That's exactly what happened. He was made governor of Egypt. As second in command, Joseph instituted this plan to gather a fifth of all of the grain for the 7 years of abundance. So he had everybody bring a fifth of everything, all their harvest, so they could put it back in reserves for the coming famine. And sure enough, they had the 7 years of abundance, and then the famine hit. And because of his planning and because of his stewardship of their resources, Egypt was okay, right? But this famine was widespread, y'all. A matter of fact, the scripture actually says it was over all the earth. It was widespread famine. But it even reached Canaan, where he grew up with his father and with his brothers, was about 250, 300 miles away from Egypt. So it eventually hit them. And about 2 years into that, it had got very bad in Canaan. So Jacob had decided to send his remaining sons to Egypt to try to buy grain, because if not, they were going to starve to death. So the brothers traveled to, well, all the brothers except for one. Jacob obviously didn't change much because he still had a favorite son, because his favorite wife had given birth to Benjamin. So he sent the other boys to Egypt to try to buy grain for food. And little did they know that this would land them right in front of their brother Joseph. Now, mind you, they had no idea that he was governor of Egypt, right? They probably figured, well, he's either dead or he's working out somewhere, slaving away as a slave. They really didn't care. So they had no idea they were going to stand before Joseph. So they come before Joseph, and they don't recognize him. This has been basically 13 years from the time we see him as the favorite son to the time he was put in as Pharaoh, and then 7 years of abundance, and then the famine started. So it had been a long time, and he's wearing garments that, are Egyptian in nature. If you've ever watched movies, Egyptian dudes wear funky makeup and different things like that. So they had no idea this was Joseph. So his brothers, the ones that sold him into slavery, are standing before him now at risk of starving to death with their family, unless Joseph finds it in his heart to sell them grain to these foreigners that the Egyptians had put back to preserve their nation. This was the moment of truth, right? What would you do if this was your story? Would you start concocting a plan like, yeah, what do you need now? What am I going to do now? Was he going to seize his opportunity for revenge? Now, there is a long scenario if you get into scripture. He does several things I don't know if he's trying to test their integrity to see, have these brothers had a change of heart at all, or they still the same guys they used to be? So there's a series of events that they took place, and he made them go home and bring back their other brother. A lot of stuff that was going on. But eventually, he had brought them in, and this is what he said. Genesis 45, 2 through 8. Joseph ends up sending everyone except his brothers out of the room. Then he cried so loudly that the Egyptians heard him and told about it in the king's palace. Joseph asked his brothers if his father was still alive, but they were too frightened to answer. Joseph told them, "Come closer to him." And when they did, he said, "Yes, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt." But listen to what he says, y'all. "Don't worry or blame yourselves for what you did. God is the one who sent me ahead of you to save lives. There has already been a famine for 2 years, and for 5 more years no one will plow fields or harvest grain. But God sent me ahead of you to keep your families alive and to save you in this wonderful way. After all, you weren't really the ones who sent me here. It was God. He made me the highest official in the king's court and placed me over all of Egypt." So Joseph ends up, again, long story made short, he sends for the rest of his family, brings them in, places them in a beautiful plot of land called the land of Goshen. Old folks in the house, y'all familiar with that? Christy's grandmother used to say, well, land of Goshen. That's what they're referring to, land of Goshen. But he provides for their needs. As you look back across Joseph's life, it was crazy, right? He lived this roller coaster life of being favorite son to slave, to overseer of the house, to prisoner, to overseer of the prison, to forgotten prisoner, and eventually to governor over all of Egypt. Where do you see yourself in that story? Can you relate to any of those places where Joseph found himself? Which one do you relate more to? Are you the favorite sibling? Or maybe you see yourself more in the despised sibling, the one that's hated by your brothers or your sisters. Maybe you feel like one that's been enslaved through no fault of your own. Maybe you can understand the feeling of that prisoner, that you're suffering for something that you really didn't do. Or maybe you can empathize with that forgotten prisoner, where you feel like you've been forgotten. And maybe at one time you thought God was going to use your life, but you're like, he's forgotten me. The things that he once spoken to my life, they're gone, they're not going to happen. Matthew 5:45 says this: he makes the sun rise on both good and bad people, and he sends rains for the ones who do right and for the ones who do wrong. Are you the type of person that you don't honor God, even though you've been blessed, because you feel like, well, it was my hard work, it was my determination that's caused me to be blessed, so you steal that glory from God? Or maybe you're the type of person that when things are going good for you, you come to church, you worship him, you pray, you live right, but as soon as something starts going awry, you start shaking your fist at God. Like, I knew this wasn't good. People told me if I tried to live for Christ, I knew it. I knew you wouldn't follow through. Is that you? Have you ever been there? Are you ever torn with those feelings? Maybe you've been badly betrayed by someone. Maybe you've been abused. Maybe you've been used by someone in some way that's been deeply, deeply wounding to you. And you can't let go of that. You just can't shake it. You try to go through life and you try to not think about it, but deep down somewhere, you can't let that go. Is that you? Here's two things I know. No matter where you relate yourself, you have two pretty simple choices. You can blame or you can bless. You can blame God for what's happened to you, or you can say, in spite of it all, I know you've got my good at heart. You know, a couple weeks ago, Pastor Mark was talking about the power of the path. We're not always going to be at our destination. Sometimes we're in the journey, and things happen during that journey. And maybe things might not go as you hoped to, right? Or maybe it's not moving as fast as you had hoped. But there is a journey. And we need to get to that place like Joseph did, where you can let go of that and realize. He told his brother, look at what his brothers did. He was like, it wasn't you that sent me here. It was God. God had all this lined up. One of my favorite authors, Max Lucado, he has a wonderful way with words. He says this, he says, X-ray the world of the enraged, and you'll find a tumor of bitterness, black, menacing, and malignant. Cancer of the spirit. Its fatal fibers creep around the edge of the heart and ravage it. Yesterday, you can't alter, but your reaction to yesterday, you can. The past, you cannot change, but your response to your past, you can. The Bible gives us very clear directions. In Ephesians 4:31-32, it says, stop being bitter and angry and mad at others. Instead, be kind and merciful and forgive others just as God forgave you because of Christ. When you and I sin, we go against the will of God. But listen, we don't thwart the purpose of God. We thwart ourselves. Our job is not to work out the details. Joseph didn't. Our job is to remain pure and usable in the hands of God. He will work out the details. He did so in the case of Joseph, and he'll do it for you. Nowhere in this account do we see Joseph feeling sorry for himself or blaming others, blaming God or blaming his brothers or blaming Potiphar or blaming Potiphar's wife. He simply took each situation as it came and he remained faithful. And he made the best out of every situation he found himself in. The biggest problem is in life is not having problems. Our problem is thinking that having problems is a problem. Did you follow that? Let me say that again. The biggest problem in life is not having problems. Our problem is thinking that having problems is a problem. That doesn't mean we're always pleased with what takes place or what's happened to us or where we find ourselves. But in the midst of everything, we remain faithful. We hold on to our faith and we live a life that reflects our God. Serving under every circumstance with excellence. Everything he did, obviously he did not do it half-hearted, right? He's like, okay, well, I'm finding myself here, so I'm gonna do it. No, he did it with excellence. And God blessed him. He blessed him in the prison. He blessed him in the house. Everywhere he went, blessings followed him. God uses tests in our lives, not as a punishment, but as preparation. James 1 and 2 says, God will bless you if you don't give up when your faith is tested. He will reward you with a glorious life, just as he rewards everyone who loves him. We have to trust that God will trump evil. The details of your story compared to that of Joseph may be different, but the pattern in our lives is often the same. Moments of great triumph to moments of great pain. Seasons of great gain leading to seasons of great loss. But never forget, what Satan intends for evil, God will use for good. You can blame God, or you can bless God. C.S. Lewis wrote this: God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. Are you experiencing pain this morning? Is something going on in your life where you don't know where to turn, you don't know what to do, and you don't understand why it's happening to you, but you just know you have a pain that is very real? Is God shouting to you in that pain? What's he saying? How might he be inviting you to respond to that pain? The biblical account of the life of Joseph shows that Joseph did not endure the suffering because of his own sin, but for a greater good, to save the lives of many. And just like so many biographies we read in the Old Testament, it's a precursor, right? It's pointing us to Christ, the one that suffered greatly, not because of any sin of his own, but for our greater good. Place your trust in the path, in the process, and more than anything in the character of God. He wants what's best for you even more than you want it for yourself. Stop blaming and start blessing. Let's stand. Now, I have no doubt